Glömde jag precis säga till Thomas Nilsson som var innan. Det är 10 minuter kvar.
Okej.
Men det vet du redan. Bara upprepa frågorna för de hörs inte där ute.
Ja, just det. Precis. Mm.
Perfekt. Då är jag i start.
Okej. James. Just det. Jag ska kolla ditt namn, jag glömde bort. James. Sorry? Vad sa du? Precis, Jeeves. James. Är det dags eller?
Ja.
Då kör vi. All right. Can you hear me? Are you still awake? Yes? Why do I always get the last session of conferences and have to do stuff to keep people awake? What I will do to keep you awake is force you to participate. So my buddy James here will be handing out green and pink stickies. And you will have to self-organize to try to get a hold of one of each color. So what I hope to see is this in your hands. We'll have a few minutes before I start using them. So I'll be talking. In the meantime, you spread these around. Okay, so hi, I'm Henrik. I'm a consultant at CRISP, and I work as agile coach. And I'm here to talk about Scrum and XP Beyond the trenches. And well, I found this really nice picture, which I think summarizes what an agile coach does, which is this. Try to trigger change, and it's not always easy. So I'd like to tell a little bit of a story, which has had a huge impact on my life. In fact, it has pretty much changed my life, and it happened about 4 years ago. In fact, I started digging around in my emails, and it turned out to be November 10th, and I was sick. So I was in bed for that weekend, and my head was full of ideas of stuff that I'd learned from helping a company implement change. And I was bored, so I grabbed my computer and I started writing down, if I don't write this stuff down, I'm going to probably forget it, so I better write down what I learned. And I wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote in a feverish kind of extreme focus, and somehow managed to squeeze out about 70 pages in a weekend with a few hours of sleep once in a while. It was crazy. I don't think I could do that stunt again. But anyway, as a result, I wasn't quite sure what to do with this pile of this kind of blog entry that ran out of control. So I sent an email to the Scrum Alliance, to the Scrum development email list, and kind of what should I do with this? And that started a series of changes, which 4 years later, this thing, which wasn't even planned to become a book, had been downloaded 250,000 times. It's incredible. What happened? It's weird. And it translated to 12 languages, but not Swedish, actually, which is interesting. And I'd never before been to any kind of conference like this. It wasn't even on my map. I didn't realize that there are these things called conferences, and you learn a lot of stuff at them. But after writing this thing, then people started calling, and then suddenly I was all over the world doing talks and doing courses and doing coaching, and it was really crazy, but also very fun. And then now, the other week, I sat down and I actually, for the first time in a long time, actually reread the book. And like, okay, well, what did I actually say here? And started reflecting around that, and that's kind of the basis of this talk. Because during these 4 years of coaching, and doing training and coaching, I've discovered some things. Number one, I discovered that other people have been discovering the same stuff that we did. So people would tell me things like, hey, I read your book and everything you wrote about was familiar to me because we kind of discovered all those things too, independently. So that was interesting. It couldn't be a coincidence. The stuff we were discovering in terms of patterns for how to solve typical problems in software development, things we were discovering weren't unique. A second thing I discovered was that people don't read disclaimers. See, there's this disclaimer in the book which says, and I'm going to read it out loud to you because since people don't tend to read it, this document does not claim, and this document is the Trenches book, Scrum and XP from the Trenches, right? This document does not claim to represent the right way to do Scrum. It only represents one way to do Scrum, the result of constant refinement over a year's time. You might even decide that we've got it all wrong. So it's not intended to be kind of copy-pasted. But that's exactly what happened. So I've been bumping into people saying things like, this is the paper to read if you want to avoid learning Agile by trial and error. This is actually a quote, which I found. And people saying, we've adapted it as our tech Bible here at our company. I've heard this word Bible several times, and it's very flattering, but it's also frightening. Right? This was not intended to be a kind of checklist of how to do Scrum. So that was a bit frightening, and I've been waiting for someone to sue me, saying that, hey, we followed this Bible, and it didn't work, so now you owe us a lot of money. My lawyers will be getting in touch with you. This hasn't happened yet. Number three, a positive discovery, though, was, are you passing these around, by the way? Don't let them stop, right? Who has Post-it notes in your hands? Oh, wow, that's very impressive. Okay. Anyway, discovery number three was copy-paste worked better than I thought. Because people were copy-pasting practices from this book, which I thought wouldn't work. But it did work in most cases, and that was a surprise to me. So people were saying things like, I've started using Scrum in my company, and it's been a success, thanks to your valuable information, which was once again flattering, but also very surprising. It's like, what happened to inspect and adapt? How could somebody... I was at one company which builds embedded software for cockpits and airplanes, and they just took our practices, which we use when developing online games, and just copy-pasted them. And I was like, but it turned out that it worked for them. So that was a bit of a surprise. But of course, it didn't always work. So what I bump into now increasingly often is things like, maybe at a training course, someone says, well, yeah, our problem is we spend way too much time arguing over focus factor. And I'm like, well, who cares about focus factor? Why do you waste time on that? And they say, well, because we learned about it from your book. Like, what? And then I go back to that book and, oh, darn, I've written like 5 pages about focus factor. Oops. Well, we actually stopped doing that right after the book came out because we learned better ways. And this is happening quite more and more frequently, so I figured I better do something about it. So this talk is kind of like the embryo to what might become an article, which depends on your feedback. So I'm going to be asking you some questions, and then depending on your feedback, this may or may not turn into an article. So the purpose of this presentation. Many of the solutions turned out to be much more universally applicable than I ever would have thought. In other words, patterns, right? Number 2, I've learned a lot since then, and there are some things I would have done differently if I could go back in time or send like a message back in time. And the purpose of this presentation is to share these insights with you. All right? Is that why you're here? Does that make sense? Silence. Yeah. I told you were tired. So here's how this feedback device works. Whenever you see that signal, I'm going to be expecting you to tell me, do you agree with whatever recommendation I just gave you? And the green is like yes, pink or red is no. And if you kind of don't have an opinion on this matter, then just keep your hand down. So let's try this. Don't eat yellow snow. Good? Yeah? Most people agree? That's good. I'll give you a more difficult one. Driving is dangerous. Driving can be, yeah, pretty much agreed there. And since driving is dangerous, you want to spend as little time as possible on the road, so you better drive very fast. Well, they're kind of divided there, pretty divided. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so it seems to work. So here's recommendation number 1. By the way, they're not in any particular order, and I have 15 of them, so I'll be keeping a pretty high pace. And then maybe, quick questions are fine, but discussions and stuff I'd rather save till afterwards, because there's a lot of people in here, and discussions don't tend to work with like 200 people. Okay, recommendation number 1, limit all queues. Here's a backlog, or let's say a bug database or an issue tracker, whatever you like, a list of stuff to do, and it's 3 items long. So how many ways are there to sort this list? 6, right? 3 factorial, 3 times 2 times 1 is 6. So if you have a product owner or somebody, and their job is to sort the list, then there are 6 different options, right? What about this one? More than 6 is a hint. It's 120. It's quite a lot, suddenly. There's 5 items, there's 120 different ways of sorting it. You can see where this is heading, right? This is a list of 10 items. There's 3.5 million ways of sorting a list of 10 items. Here's a list of 20 items. There are 2 billion ways of sorting this thing, or 2 million ways of sorting this, pretty innocent-looking list of 20 items. I'm curious, how many of you here have a backlog or a bug database which has 100 or more items? That's about half. So you have some poor guy who's called a product owner whose job is to sort this list. And there are this many ways. Oh, there are 9 times 10 to the 150. There's 157 zeros, which is incidentally a whole lot more than the number of atoms in the universe. Ways of sorting this list. In fact, if every single atom in the universe was a universe on its own, and we counted all those atoms as well, it would still be more. So it's a problem. And what's the solution? Well, limit the size of these lists. How many of you do that? A few. Okay, this is a good pattern. So how does it work? Well, out of all this stuff, you kind of select what seems to be the 10 most important ones, and then the rest you put in a bag. The bag is pretty much a metaphor for the trash can, but it feels a bit better. It's the bag. Sometimes I say put it in the pit. Right? It's some place where it's not going to. You don't have to deal with it. The CCB is not going to sit there and go through these items. Right? So select the 10 most important ones, and whenever one of these gets implemented, I can't point. Why am I trying to point? Whenever one of those 10 gets implemented, then there's a slot, so you can choose which one is the most important now. And it doesn't have to come from the bag. It could come from somebody else. And what happens if you have some new issue? This one right here, which is blinking. This one's important. I want to do this, but darn, the top 10 list is full. So what do? Well, I better compare this item against the other 10. And 10 is not a very big number. You can compare a thing to 10 items, right? It doesn't take too long. And if it turns out that, well, it's more important than that one, so I better kick that one out and put this one in. That's the process. So it's kind of just-in-time prioritization as things come in. This is a recommendation. No matter what kind of lists or queues you have anywhere in your process, find some kind of a limit. And it doesn't have to be 10, just any kind of limit. Right? That's pretty much it. What do you think? Wow, very strong agreement. I'm going to take notes. I'd say on a scale of 1 to 5, that was a 5 in terms of agreements. Okay, next recommendation. Visualize the top 3 impediments. Oh, look, it says top 3. I've limited the list. Here's a Scrum team, and a good Scrum Master will produce a list of what are the biggest impediments of our team. You could turn that into something more positive and say, what are the 3 biggest improvement opportunities? It could be things like a better build server, or we need to change the time for the daily stand-up, or we need better chairs, or less disruptions from that group over there, or whatever. These are impediments. And having a top 3 list and voting what should be on that list after every retrospective seems to have a very strong impact on a lot of things. First of all, it increases the likelihood that these things will get solved. Second of all, it seems to improve people's motivation. They can see that, well, this thing that bugs me is now on the top 3 list. It will be solved soon. And this thing over here that bugs me, but that's not on the top 3 list, is probably not going to be solved right now. So I'm not going to get bugged by it for the time being. So it seems to have some kind of a motivational effect. And if you have several teams, and you have someone in a management position, this is great for that person, because now they know exactly what they should be doing, right? The 3 teams have just given you information about exactly what you should do. In fact, this is the backlog for management, right? These are the things that you as manager need to be solving. Makes life a lot easier. Plus, improves collaboration between management and the teams. Very simple thing, but I can strongly recommend it. Here's another version of it. Oh, by the way, if the manager tends to forget the stuff he said he was going to fix, one of my colleagues did this. He put up a piece of paper on the manager's door, and on it says, team impediments that I have committed to solving. And it's limited. You can only fit about 4 Post-its on that thing, right? So it's limited. That's every day, every time the manager walks into his room, he'll see this thing on the door as a reminder. Oh yeah, I said I was going to get money for a better build system or whatever it was. Very useful. Another version of that is we have a bunch of teams here, and they meet once in a while in a cross-team retrospective. So each team has their own retrospective, and once in a while, maybe every second week or so, they have a cross-team retrospective where they all meet up, kind of like a Scrum of Scrums. And there's other people there too, the product owner, or if there's different projects, we have maybe multiple product owners, and other downstream teams, such as operations manager maybe, the guy who's going to take the consequences of all of our crappy code, or whatever, right? And maybe the dev manager, pretty much all key stakeholders here. And there we identify what is our common list of top 3 impediments for the whole project. And this tends to create a systems thinking perspective. Instead of optimizing each team locally, we get together and talk about what's our biggest common issue, and then we try to solve that. So that's a recommendation. What are your thoughts on that? Okay, not very controversial, quite easy. That's definitely a 5. Does anybody already do this? Quite few. Okay. So number 3, continuously measure employee satisfaction, or team member, or whatever you want to write there. People satisfaction. I'll give an example from our company. We'd have this simple spreadsheet, online Google spreadsheet, and the people are asked to go in there and update on a fairly regular basis, and most people do. And it's basically, how does it feel being here at this company on a scale of 1 to 5? How does it feel to come to work? Right? And just to manage this, we have a nice updated stamp. And what feels best right now? Just some comments about what feels best and what feels worst, and what would improve your satisfaction level. Just some comments. And this has turned out to be very useful in all kinds of contexts. We've seen some of our clients start using this because it gives you a leading indicator of problems. You find out early if things are about to go bad. If you use more financial metrics, such as if we notice that our business is starting to go downhill economically, probably it's a bit too late. The cause of that problem probably occurred way back in time. So you get a delayed response. With this, you can detect problems early, because if something is bugging people, probably that's going to lead to a bigger problem later. So very, very useful, and then you can track this over time and look for trends and see and correlate it to specific events. So at CRISP, we noticed that our conferences really work. They help everybody feel better because we solve problems. It was nice to kind of have data showing that these conferences are valuable, just as an example. When I showed this to Jeff, he went like, awesome! And he started using this at his company and started blogging about it and started telling everybody. And I was really surprised because I thought this was more common than it was. Maybe it wasn't. This is a pretty good quote from Russell Ackoff. It's better to use imprecise measures of what is wanted rather than precise measures of what is not. So this is an imprecise measure of what is wanted. We can't measure exactly how people are feeling, but a rough scale of 1 to 5 gives us some kind of information. Other things like working hours, how many hours you are at work, very easy to measure, but not very useful. Right? So, what do you think? I think you guys are just being nice. Once again, this is one of those things that it's really easy to do, so there's really nothing that stops you from doing it. And of course, you can do it anonymously if you like. Recommendation number 4, have a chief product owner role. So once again, these are things that I wish I kind of knew back then, things I would have done if somebody had told me. Right? And what's that? Well, here's a product owner, and there's his backlog. And right now, I'm kind of assuming that most of you are fairly familiar with Scrum. If you're not, then I'm sorry. There are some books here you might want to pick up in that case after the presentation. So anyway, so that's a very typical Scrum team setup, right, with product owner. Now, in some cases, there's 2 teams pulling off the same product backlog. And once you start getting a few of these teams, you might think that, well, these are independent products. They're independent. They're working independently of each other. But you're probably wrong. Because if they're in the same company, there almost always are dependencies. If not technical, there are dependencies such as who gets access to that build environment first, or who decided that the middle product owner there gets 2 teams? Who gets that new DBA that we just hired, that star, right, etc. So there needs to be some kind of synchronization. And get these product owners together. Get them to meet. And unless they happen to be very good at agreeing with each other, you probably need somebody to moderate that group and to have the final say in, well, okay, what is our actual strategic direction right now? So the role of the chief product owner, no matter whatever you choose to call him, it doesn't have to be called chief product owner. You might already have a person called something else, which actually does this. But the idea is make it explicit. This person right here is responsible for making sure that our different Scrum projects are aligned. I've found a lot of my clients, when they have problems, once we do the root cause analysis, it turns out that the root cause was not having a chief product owner. It happens surprisingly often. That's why I bring it up. And once we introduce this role and make it functional, then a lot of those problems kind of melt away. So very interesting. What do you think? Do you agree with this recommendation? That's a 5. By the way, you can look around too if you're curious about what other people are voting. Recommendation number 5. Express backlogs items as user stories. This will come as no news to most of you, but I still want to bring it up because I keep finding it very useful. This notion of expressing agile requirements in this format. Now, I don't mean necessarily that it has to look exactly like this. It doesn't have to say as a blah, I want blah, so that blah. But the essence of what we're expressing in the backlog is these things. And when I find teams that do that, anybody can grab a backlog item and it will tell them who wants what and why. It tends to make things a lot easier in very many different ways. So, and there are some guidelines for this. I'm not going to go through them. Anybody who's not familiar, doesn't feel very used to this way of working might pick up any of Mike Cohn's books around this, or just Google around. There's plenty of material. But there's guidelines about how to create these. And I'd also like to reiterate something which I did write in the book, which I really still think is a good idea, and I keep finding teams that seems to work well, is to complement the as a blah, blah, blah kind of high-level, vague-ish user story with a very concrete scenario on the back side of the card, or on another column in the spreadsheet, or whatever tool you use. So basically, the thing at the top, the as a buyer thing, that's like a problem statement, and the how to demo is like a solution example. So you get a bit of both. What do you think? Right? Even old things can be good to bring up again, right? Well, this is too easy. But it's not done yet. We might get some controversial stuff later, who knows? Some people tell me that, Henrik, during your talks, you don't challenge people enough. Maybe that's what's going on here. Here's a recommendation. It's very, very practical. But sometimes when I do training courses, people tell me, the biggest aha moment was when you showed us these physical tools. And that kind of makes me happy, but also a little bit like, oh, darn, if that was the biggest takeaway. But so what are we talking about here? In my book, I wrote that you have to have tape, or these things fall down. Well, they don't. If you buy super stickies, then they actually don't fall down. So you can buy those things. I put up, you can't see the links, I think, but or you can. But if you look at the slides afterwards, you can find links to where you can buy these things. And no, I'm not getting any commission from this. So super sticky is highly recommended. These index cards, a lot of teams use task boards where they have post-it notes moving around, which is fine, but they tend to be kind of break down after a while, and it just doesn't feel that great to move stickies around on a wall over a long period of time. These kind of physical cards feel a lot better, and they last longer. So I can recommend using these simple cards, right? And there's different sizes. And if you find, it's quite nice to have them stick on the wall too. So it's magnet tape, the big trade secret of Scrum Masters, right? Magnet tape, and it's sticky on. It's magnetic and it's sticky on only one side. So you put it up there and it stays there. It's really nice. And then when you put all the cards back in the box, they don't stick together, right? It's cool. Come on. It is. And this magic chart, not cheap, but it does pay for itself. It's very useful. If you're in a workshop and you don't have enough whiteboard space and you want to prototype a task board or something, then go to Svanström's and buy a roll of this. And it sticks to pretty much anything. And you can take something like a card, and without putting anything on the card, see if this will work. Yeah, it stays up there too, or just pieces of paper or whatever. So now you have a portable task board. Great for prototyping. Or perhaps you're in a session and you do have a whiteboard and it doesn't have wheels, and you do want to take the thing with you when you're finished. So why not use this and prototype your task board on this thing? And once you've kind of figured out how you want it to look like, you just grab this and walk off to your team room, and then either stick it up or create a proper version of it. So this is just a very useful thing. It's not a long-term solution. They tend to fall down after a while, but it's a very good workshop thing. So, little details, small things, but teams that use these tools, they use them every day. Everybody's using them every day, so it makes a difference. Any thoughts on that? And now people are going to tell me the biggest takeaway from your session was showing the magic chart. I'm like, damn. All right, let's keep going. Recommendation number 7, and I think we're actually, surprisingly enough, pretty much on schedule. Who would have known that? Estimate stories before the sprint planning meeting. In my book, I wrote a lot about, and then during the sprint planning meeting, the first thing we do is estimation sessions and things like that. And basically, I can recommend not doing it that way. It just seems that most companies that do that, they do estimation during sprint planning meeting. It seems to just take too long, and then they don't have time to do the actual sprint planning. So this seems to be a better pattern. At some time before you start your first sprint, you need to create the initial product backlog. You can't really get away from that. But once you have just enough product backlog to get a sprint started, right? There's our sprint, with their planning, and the dots do work. Can you see this dot? Yeah. So planning, and then the retrospective at the end, and the demo. But as a background process, we got this backlog grooming thing going on. It's not a formal practice in Scrum, but it maybe even should be, because it just seems to work well. Have some kind of a routine where the product owner and the team and whichever stakeholders are needed meet every week. Let's say at, for example, Wednesdays, 10 to 11 o'clock. It's a backlog grooming workshop, and that's where they do breakdown and estimation and all that kind of agile estimating and planning stuff. And that means they get several passes at making the backlog in good shape. So by the time we get to the sprint planning meeting, there's no confusion. We kind of know what has to be done. So we can focus the sprint planning meeting on actually planning this specific sprint. Yeah, what do you think? So again, little things, but they do make a difference, it seems. Just out of curiosity, since everybody was green here, how many of you, put the green thing up again if this is something that you're kind of already doing, something like this. Just about half. And, okay, down again. And those of you who aren't doing it but kind of think that, well, this is something that we'd like to be doing, put your, okay, so it's about 50-50. So half of you are like, we do this and we like it, and half are like, we would like to do this. That's interesting information. Thanks. All right, next recommendation. Tasks. So what is a task? Just as a reminder, this is a backlog item or a user story, of course, at a fairly vague level. And user stories are designed to be split into smaller user stories. They're kind of designed to be fractal. So this one is now split into smaller ones. And these smaller things are still user stories because they're still kind of deliverable. And they're still things that a customer cares about. These things are tasks. And the difference is that the tasks are stuff that the customer doesn't really care about. They're technical mumbo-jumbo from a client perspective. And they're verbs. So all these are verbs: write, create, do. Right? There's things that you do. While the backlog items are things that you want to achieve. They're like problem statements. Another difference is that these yellow tasks aren't valuable on their own. They you have to do them all before you really get anything that you can deliver. So a lot of teams use this kind of task breakdown. If you read any Scrum book, there'll be a lot of information in there about creating tasks and estimating them and updating the estimates. But there are other ways to do it. First of all, some teams don't even estimate at all. They just count stories. So our velocity is 8 stories per sprint, and then that's fine. Some are big and some are small, but it tends to even out. Any of you are in that? Any of you do that? Just a few, just a few. It's not too common, but it seems to be getting more and more popular. Some estimate in t-shirt size. In other words, this story here is a medium. I don't know how much bigger it is than a small, but it's definitely bigger. Anybody use t-shirt sizing? A minority, but at least more people are doing t-shirt sizes than not estimating. Story points is kind of the typical agile, what you'd read about in most books. How many of you do that? Story points. So I don't know if 2 is 2 days or 5 days, but I know that 2 is about twice as much as 1. Right? And then there's estimating in days. How many do that? Right? If you do that. Right? These are all different options, right? So don't feel forced to do any specific one of these. Find the one that fits you best. Same with tasks. Some teams just skip them. Well, our stories are so small, so we don't need to do this extra breakdown. Others do break them down, but they don't estimate them. So yeah, to implement this feature, a cancel flight ticket, we need to do some GUI code, and we need to write some service stuff, and we need to have a design modeling session, and we need to have a meeting with the customer and do some refactoring and blah, blah, blah. 8 or 9 stickies. But who cares which ones are big, which ones are small? We just get them up there. And then we can follow up our sprint. We can do a sprint burn down based on the number of notes on the wall. Very nice and simple. And then there's estimating in days and estimating in hours. So my recommendation, just based on observing teams and seeing what seems to work and what seems to not work so well, my default tends to be this nowadays. Either one of those two in terms of stories, and for tasks, just don't estimate them. I see so many teams that are stuck in some kind of estimation hell. Every day at the daily Scrum, they spend more than half of the time arguing about numbers on stickies instead of actually talking about useful stuff. So that's my personal opinion. What do you think? Even that you mostly agreed on, but not entirely. So I'm going to give that a 4. There was a few pinkies. And once again, remember, every context is unique. So you might be in a context where estimating in hours is great. So don't take my word for it. But if you do estimate in hours and days, at least ask that question at the next retrospective. Do we really want to do this? And what value does it give us? And shall we try something else for a few sprints? Right, next one. Yeah, the focus factor thing. I wrote a lot about that in my book, and it seems to push people in the wrong direction. It seems to push people in the direction of making false assumptions, such as, well, our focus factor is 40% because we finished 18 story points in 45 man days. And next sprint, we have 50 man days, So 50 man days times 40% is 20, so we shall therefore take on 20 story points. And that carries the faulty assumption that there's a direct correlation between the number of hours and the amount of stuff delivered per sprint. Now, what happens if you have a well-functioning team and you add a new team member? Does velocity go up or down? Depends on if you're a manager. Yeah, most people's experience seems to be that it goes down, at least in the short term. So there's no real direct correlation. So it's a little bit dangerous. Plus, somebody outside of the team, maybe a manager, might look at this and do some math. They bring up their Excel, right? And they go, you guys should be able to deliver this much. And you get this whole meaningless discussion about how much you should be able to deliver instead of focusing on what are we able to deliver. So there are some useful cases for focus factor. Here's one example, bootstrapping a new project when you have a new team. You have no history. So we get the team together and we ask them to estimate these 4 stories in story points. Just what's the relative size between these? We don't know how many days, but what's the relative size? And then we decide based on, we can choose a team size and we can choose a sprint length. Those are numbers that are in our control. So based on that, we asked the team, how long would it take in ideal time to implement that story up there if we could have just the right number of people, undisturbed? And the answer might be, well, we think that would be 2 people working together for 3 days, locked into a room with pizza. Okay. So that means 2 story points equals 6 ideal man days. But not all days are ideal. So how many of our days are ideal? Well, we don't know, so let's just say 50%, just to guess something. After that, it's just math. A sprint is 10 days, which is 60 man days, and half of those are ideal. That's 30 ideal man days. And divide that by 3, and we get 10 story points per sprint. So now we have an estimated velocity. It might be wrong, but at least it's some kind of estimate based on something, right? But it might be wrong. So once we do our sprint, we will measure what our actual velocity was, and maybe it turned out that our velocity was 8. We finished these 4 things in a sprint, and they added up to 8. That's what matters. Once you have that one number, you don't need to worry about the hours and the focus factor and all that math, right? It says 8 up there. So that gives us a reasonable idea for how much we should pull in the next sprint. And after 2 or 3 sprints, you'll start seeing a trend, and then that's enough. There's nothing new about this. This is kind of old school agile estimating and planning. But what I want to get to is it seems like this is enough in most cases. So doing the more scientific way of going through the hours and the focus factor seems to give you more precision, but no more accuracy. And it costs more time. Of course, once you have this information, you can do release planning. So our velocity is that far on the product backlog, and based on that, we should be down here around May and maybe down there around June. So this is enough to do rough release planning. Right, what do you think about skipping focus factor? Oh, yes. That's great. That's a 5. Okay, don't fill the sprint, the recommendation. The sprint commitment is sometimes misunderstood in terms of when the sprint planning is done and the team is walking away with a bunch of stories. That doesn't mean we promise to achieve this goal or to finish all these items. We can't promise that. We don't know. There is randomness and variation. So this is a misunderstanding. The sprint commitment is more something like this. We the team, promise that we believe this goal is reachable right now. And we'll do everything we can to reach it. And we'll let you know as soon as that would change. As soon as we don't believe we can reach it anymore, then we'll let you know. We believe we can finish all these specific stories, and no matter what happens, we will demonstrate releasable code at the end of the sprint. So that's the only kind of hard promise. No matter what happens, something's going to come out at the end of the sprint. You can trust us in that. If we fall behind schedule, we'll talk to you, the product owner, and if necessary, move the lowest priority stories first. So we can't say we promise to finish everything. Instead, we're saying we'll promise that we'll finish as much as we can. But no matter what happens, something's going to come out at the end. And if we get ahead of schedule, we'll add stuff to the sprint. We won't just go home and sleep. We'll add stuff to the sprint, unless we agree to some other kind of convention. But that's the default. Add stuff to the sprint from the product backlog. And we'll be honest and transparent. We'll show our progress and status on a daily basis, typically on something like this, on a board or equivalent. And everything that we do deliver is done, based on the definition of done. This is kind of a better version of the sprint commitment, a more honest version. Now, how does that impact sprint planning meeting? Well, let's say this is our product backlog, right? And we're about to do a sprint planning meeting, which is all about filling up this list over here. That's sort of there, to the right, the one to the right. It's about figuring out what do we pull into the sprint. So maybe it turns out that, well, we, the team, we're pretty sure we can finish these. And the product owner says, I'm pretty sure these won't change. These are really high priority, and that won't change. These yellow ones, the team says, we can probably finish some of them, but probably not all. And the product owner might say, well, some of these might change, the priorities. I think we need these, but I'm not sure. That might change. And then these pink ones, team says, we won't be able to finish any of these, right? So my recommendation is that the sprint plan equals that, and not including these yellow ones. And this is a little bit different from maybe the typical schoolbook Scrum. Here we just leave a big bunch of slack, because it saves us from having to spend a lot of time arguing over exactly how much of these yellows will we finish, which saves us time. It also saves us friction if it turns out that we didn't finish them, and it gives us more flexibility, because during the sprint, halfway through the sprint, the product owner realized that now I want this yellow one, the fourth yellow one right here, I want that one, and then we actually have some slack to pull it in. So I see a lot of friction from teams that try very hard to fill the sprint, and that's just as bad idea as trying to fill up a traffic system with cars, right? You want to leave some space to get smooth flow. What do you think? All right. Those of you who put up pink ones, the absolute minority, feel free to grab me after this session, and I'll be happy to argue with you and talk about this. I think it's fun, and to trade notes. And like I said before, there's no one true answer. These are just recommendations. All right, recommendation number 11. I had 15, right? Visualize more than just a sprint. There's a sprint. Yeah, we can see exactly what we're doing, who's doing what, and how we're doing. Are we on track? The burn down shows us. It's very useful information. But what happens upstream before? Well, there's product backlog. And sometimes that product backlog is very nice and visible, but quite often it's not. It's hidden on the product owner's hidden folder somewhere, or some spreadsheet that nobody knows where it is. Try to make that visible too. And go even further. What happens before? How does stuff get in there in the first place? What ideas are out there in the works? Because there is a process of getting an idea into a ready state in the product backlog. And it's a good idea to visualize that. And downstream, what happens after the sprint? If our definition of done is releasable, which is kind of the default in Scrum, that means there's still stuff left to do after the sprint, like doing the release. And so a product owner may choose to accumulate several sprints of work before they press the release button. And it's useful to visualize that we have stuff waiting for production here, for example. So how does this look like in practice? Well, for example, like this. There's the sprint part, or what corresponds to the sprint. And there is the product backlog, and there is ideas being analyzed, and there's spikes going on and stuff being discussed. So ideas flow in from the left, and they turn into concrete backlog items here. Some get rejected. And they, in turn, flow into the sprint and get broken into tasks. So the yellow ones here are tasks. And then once it's done, then there's a user acceptance test, which in this case was outside the sprint. And there's production, so they hang around there. It's very useful to see that because there's often hidden bottlenecks and queues outside of the sprint. So make those visible. Otherwise, you'll tend to sub-optimize by just optimizing that one sprint. This is also a good place to put up stuff like, what other stuff are we doing that's not related to the sprint? Maybe we have some kind of support responsibility. So we have a lane for that here. Right? Now, some of you are thinking, but that's Kanban. Well, yeah, whatever. Here's a bigger project. It is a company which develops games. And they have 3 teams. So here we can see that, well, team number 1 is building Pac-Man, and they're in the polish state. So it's actually done. They're just making it look really pretty. And Pong is in a concept state, so they're just drawing pictures and paintings to see how might a Pong look like. It's an innovative new game. And team 3 is doing Donkey Kong, and it's playable, it works. Now they're just adding some of the extra features, some extra levels. Right? And if you want to know the details, go walk off to team 1 and look at their Scrum board. And then you can see they're just a typical Scrum board with tasks and all that. So now we have a 2-tier system, right? And back to Kanban, since we added these limits, you see it says 3 up there. We work at only 3 games at a time. And we have a queue of 1 game, which is in the game that we're going to build next. That's what kind of makes it into the stuff that we call Kanban nowadays. If you're curious about Kanban, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that now. You can feel free to come up and grab this book or just download it. It's called Kanban and Scrum. It's available for free online. But this is a very useful pattern, kind of putting a Kanban layer on top of a number of Scrum teams to make some kind of a portfolio board. So this was about visualizing more than just a sprint. What do you think? Very green. Very, very green. I should have put up some kind of trick questions, put up some really bad ideas just to check if people are automatically doing green. Make sure all the requirements are completely finished before writing any code. So once again, Kanban, use Kanban when sprints don't work. What is a sprint? A sprint is this. A fixed period of time, and decide upfront what are we going to deliver, although we might leave some slack. But the stuff we pull into the sprint is basically a batch. These things are what we're going to deliver at the end. And we commit, do some kind of commit. So there's two things, planning and committing, or I guess prioritizing and committing. And at the end, there's some kind of a release. Something's got to come out, at least for a demo. And then there is a retrospective, right? This is 4 things crammed into one. And you do this over and over again. And that's what a sprint is. So sprint is a time-boxed, fixed commitment iteration, which is very nice and simple and very useful in many contexts, but not all. So if this model is inappropriate in your context, you might be doing this instead. Every 4 weeks, we do retrospectives. Every second week, we do planning, and we skip commit. Planning is just figuring out what things are next on the list. It's populating the input side of the board, right over here. And then a release every Friday. Whatever's done gets released on Friday. So it's a release train. And whatever's done gets released. Whatever's not done doesn't get released. At Google Chrome, they're starting to do this. It's a 6-week release train. Every 6 weeks, whatever's done gets released. Whatever's not quite yet done, they just disable that so it's not visible. And then they press the release button. Event-driven, maybe a support organization. Retrospectives every 4 weeks. Planning is on demand. So when they're about to run out of stuff to do, they trigger a planning session. Or if the customer changes his mind, the priorities are now different than what they were, then the customer triggers a planning meeting. So it happens when it happens. And release is on demand. We release when there's something worth releasing. This is a little bit frighteningly close to chaos. So there's a thin line there. But these are all options, right? And if you're not doing sprints, you need something else to create what I like to call, what did I call that? Positive release pressure. It's a pressure to release, but kind of a positive pressure. The sprint is positive release pressure because something's got to be ready at the end, and that creates focus and collaboration. If you take away the sprints, you need something else. And in Kanban, that's the WIP limits, work in progress. So there's a board. Simplest possible Kanban system is basically what is it we got to do, and what are we doing right now, and what's done, right? And there's our stuff. For example, you migrate the invoicing reports to the new format, right, or whatever. And we decide that, well, with this team, we can only reasonably work effectively on 3 things at a time. After that, things start standing still. So we limit that to 3. And we don't need more than 5 things waiting in a queue in front of us, because after that, things just sit around. So we limit that to 5, just enough to keep us busy. That's pretty much Kanban, and that creates the alternative to the positive release pressure of sprints. These WIP limits force us to get something done before we can pull in something else, right? So it's an alternative. And we might put up little South Park figures to show who's doing what right now, right? If we need metrics, if we like the velocity concept of Scrum, we'll go ahead and do that. So we might just count. Every Friday, we take whatever's on the right side of the board, and we just count them and write them down. So 8 things were done on week 1, 10 things were done week 2. We just count, and that gives us a velocity. So during the next 4 weeks, we should have about 30 to 40 things done. So you can still do that. Although the more Kanban style thing to measure is lead time. Whenever something gets up on the board, write down when it got up on the board. Now when it gets off the board, write down that date too, and now you have the throughput time for that item. If you can track that, you can graph it, and you can learn that, well, it seems like 5 is our average, and some things are as quick as 3 days, some are as slow as 7 days. But 95% of everything we do takes 3 to 7 days, and that eliminates the need of estimation. Might also put that up there. They're both useful. Velocity measures how many things per unit of time, right? And cycle time measures how much time per thing. They're just different sides of the same equation. So that's the recommendation. If you don't like sprints, try Kanban. Any thoughts on that? That's a 5. And time is running out, so I'll just speed on here. Use the king and servant pattern to enable continuous delivery. This is a recommendation. If you use a centralized version control system as opposed to a distributed version control system, I don't know very much about distributed version control systems. I haven't really gotten so used to that paradigm. But if you're in the more traditional centralized version control system mindset, then I find this to be a very useful way to avoid confusion. Basically, avoiding parallelitis, the mistaken belief that you get more done by doing everything at once. Here's an example. There's the task board, and let's say, two folks right here said, we're now done with register. This feature is done. We want to publish it to the trunk, right? It's ready to go. Wait a sec, says somebody else. We're working on deposit, and we have partially complete code, and we're working on the same team branch. So if you check that in, you'll get our partially completed code. So wait till we finish. Okay, we'll wait. And guess what happens the next day? Okay, deposit is now done. Now we can go. And then the third group says, wait a sec, we're working on withdraw here. Can you please wait for us to finish? And we see this big snowball of chaos, right? And then at the end, we get merge hell. Is this familiar? It's familiar. Yeah, good. Yes, it's familiar. Okay. So here's a pattern that helps alleviate this. These stories are in priority order, right? Anybody working on the top priority story in one way or another is king. Everyone else is a servant. That's why I call it the king and the servant pattern. So let's say we have 3 people working on register. The fourth person is like, well, 3 people is just enough. If I try to help, it'll just get too confusing. So I'll start working on deposit. And that's okay. That's what self-organization is about, making these optimization trade-offs. But that means that I'm servant. So you want to be the king. So try to find ways to help work with the top priority stories. And whenever a king needs help, the servants immediately offer their services. So whoever's working on register can say, coffee, and it'll just come, right? A servant may not disrupt a king. So if the servant wants coffee, go get it yourself. A servant may never check in unreleasable code on the team branch. So I'm not allowed to check in anything that'll impact the releasability of register. A king may check in whatever he pleases, as long as he doesn't violate the branch policy. So this means that if I have stuff to check in and I'm working on deposit, I might either just not check it in, or I might put it on a feature branch, or just do anything else but putting it on the team branch and having it interrupt the register thing, right? Now, as soon as register is done, guess what happens? This bunch of servants just became kings, and this bunch of kings just became servants. Right? So this is the essence of the pattern. What do you think? Is that a useful pattern? Looks like a 4.5. No, I'll give it a 4. Just a few reds. Maybe that's the Git people. If you want to learn more about this pattern, you might want to read this article I wrote a few years ago about the mainline model. It's on InfoQ. I have a link up here too. I'm not going to talk through this horrible slide, but just if you read this and it whets your appetite, then go read the article. Right? It's about handling multiple teams with version control, based on the stable trunk pattern. Okay, recommendation number 14. Use definition of done to manage technical debt. The definition of done basically means, what do I mean when I say this thing is done, right? Is it ready to release, or is it just ready for acceptance test, or what is it? And it seems to be generally a good idea to put not only these kind of more obvious things, like merge to trunk and acceptance tested, but things like this. No increased technical debt. It's not done if you haven't cleaned up the kitchen after you're cooking, right? You're not done. And to make it even more concrete, you might put up Kent Beck's rules for simple design, which is, it's not done unless it passes all tests, and I haven't added any extra duplication, and the code is readable. It expresses all intent, and it intends all that it reveals, and my buddy can read it and explain it to me. And it's minimal. Once I've fulfilled the first 3, then I look at, is there anything unnecessary here? Do I really need 5 methods? Can I change this to 2 methods? Whatever, some kind of a code convention for what do we think is good enough. But it reduces the risk of accidentally slipping into the pit of technical debt. So that's the recommendation. Any thoughts about that? Once again, little things that seem to have an impact on the culture of an organization. It's good that I only have 15 items because I'm running out of vertical space here on the board, right? And time. Test automation backlog. This one has turned out to be immensely useful. So I can strongly recommend it if you have a mountain of legacy stuff that you want to have test automated, right? So first of all, if we take all this stuff that we wish we had automated in the past, and just talk to whoever's responsible for test, or whoever has enough knowledge to have an opinion on, what is the stuff that we need to have tested, and just list it up, right? And And then classify those tests based on, well, which ones are really important? What's the most important half? So they're marked and they're highlighted in yellow. Which half is most important in terms of risk, right? And then talk about, well, which ones are difficult to test manually? Which ones take a long time? They're highlighted in yellow. Okay, which ones take a long time to automate? Some are quite easy to automate, some take a long time. So we write that down too. And this is just a rough classification. You might add numbers if you want, low, medium, high for risk. How many hours does it take to test? And how many story points of effort is it to automate? Or maybe even hours, right? Whatever unit you want to use. Just do that. It's fairly quick. And then note that this is like a cost, and that's an investment, right? You pay this cost every time. You pay that investment once. Okay, that's step 2. And this is an ongoing process, just like any backlog. You can add stuff and change the numbers and stuff. Number 3, sort the list. Because you'll find that, well, this one up here is really important, and it takes 5 hours to test manually, and it can easily be automated within a sprint. So, that one should really be automated. It's a no-brainer. You should do it. And this one down here is opposite. It's a pain to automate and really easy to test manually. And it's not even very important. So let's just not automate that one right now. Or maybe even never. Step 3, right? And now this is a backlog. So we can take the test automation backlog, and we can put that next to the product backlog. We might separate them because the customer doesn't care about these tests, right? So we might separate the lists. And then negotiate with the product owner about some kind of a distribution of capacity. For example, 80-20. Or maybe we'll do one test automation thing per sprint, or some kind of capacity allocation. And then that's basically it. So when we do a sprint planning meeting, we would do this, right? And over time, gradually repay this debt. What do you think? Wow, I think that was 100%. That was quite impressive. I wrote an article about this. You can Google test automation backlog, but it doesn't really say anything more than what I just told you. So, okay, time's up. Let's wrap it up. Takeaway points from this session are basically find a balance, right? Appreciate your current solution while looking for a better one. So I still, when I look back at this, we did the best we could given the circumstances, and now we've learned things, and maybe now would have done things differently. But just because today's solution seems better doesn't mean yesterday's solution was bad. So be forgiving to yourself. And that, of course, applies to code as well. Right? You look at your own old code. I looked at something I wrote many years ago, and I'm like, what's this X-doclet? Ugh, felt terrible. But I remember when I wrote it back then, it felt really good. I tore it out and put in something else. And copy-pasting solutions from other contexts is okay, which I didn't think. But now I think it's okay, as long as you also adapt. Right? Just like copying code. Fine, copy-paste code. If you see someone who's done something useful over there, which might work in your context, copy it. But then, meddle with it so it fits your context. And keep experimenting, right? So make sure the learning never stops. So I hope to stand here again in 4 more years and give you some more ideas. Okay, thank you. If anybody wants some freebies, there are some books here. I'll be around for questions.